Susan, thank you for taking time with me. I am looking forward to our discussion. I wish we were in person, but I am glad for the hybridized world being able to make up for the fact that McCain Institute is distanced this year. So greetings.
Greetings. It's good to see you. Thank you so much for doing this talk, Senator. And I also just want to thank President Robbins and Ms. McCain and the Sedona Forum for hosting this talk. I'm really looking forward to our discussion.
Yeah, thank you. I will echo your thank yous to Cindy in particular, but also all the folks at Sedona Forum, McCain Institute, Arizona State. Michael Crow is one of my other go-to people to continue learning about how the digital revolution is affecting education. So Michael would be a fun addition to this conversation at some point too. But let's start there. Let me ask you, how have you seen parents, teachers as well, but especially parents' use of YouTube evolve during the pandemic as more and more people feel a proximate burden, not to just be the superintendent and the PTA and the principal of the school, but as parents are more and more aware of how much education happens close to home, how has YouTube seen their use and consumption evolve?
Well, we definitely saw a lot of changes, and I mean, when all the schools closed, and I'm a parent too, so I know it was suddenly this dramatic change for families to get used to. And one of the visions that I've always had for YouTube is to be a very large public library where anyone can access any kind of information for free. And if you think about it, we have lots and lots of how-to information. We have course information. We have speeches like this talk will be on YouTube, for example. So it's a great resource for learning. And what we saw during the pandemic was a lot of people suddenly turned to YouTube for all kinds of things, definitely for learning. So we saw homeschooling more than double in terms of people looking for that and looking for homeschooling information. But we also just saw that suddenly all these institutions that people depended upon for their support, whether it was religious organizations, community, schools, that they were suddenly shut down, and YouTube became a lifeline for them in terms of posting videos or having live conversations and connecting community. And so many people had to do things they had never done before, like fix something in their house or cut hair, make masks. So we saw lots and lots of videos about pandemic topics. And people were picking up new hobbies too, because they were at home, they didn't have a lot of stuff to do. So we definitely saw a lot of increased usage. And we saw new content too. So actually, we're virtually here at Arizona State University, and they produce some really great content with Crash Course on learning, study skills, and it's called Study Hall. And that's just one example of really great content that we have on YouTube. So I'm really pleased we could help people out during a hard time to both learn and to help get through the pandemic.
I want to think about the gap between DIY haircutting and all the Instagram-ish potential you have on YouTube of people then responding to that by posting their own pictures of home haircutting gone wrong. But let's stay instead on your term about the massive digital video library. I think about how Oxford came to be, right? Where the idea of Oxford University as this sort of umbrella institution and corporate structure is probably only 150 years old, but Oxford's colleges, at least the first 25 to 30 of them, are from 500 to 800 years old, and they essentially were wraparounds to the library, right? What the book, we weren't yet at Gutenberg, so you didn't have really, really cheap commodified content. But printing got better and better, and so books got cheaper. A library was possible, but you couldn't really have everybody owning their own books. And so the individual colleges were essentially places to sleep and eat, but mostly a place just to know your tutor professor who could help access, sort of usher you into these books. Do you envision there being wraparound communities to the YouTube library you're building? I mean, there's so much potential in the fact that everybody in the world can get access to some of the greatest lectures, if you will, or DIY content for free. The marginal cost is nothing, or we could have a debate about the monetization of the advertising of my attention span. But by and large, you're getting free digital content everywhere in the world for everybody. And yet in the past, when the book got cheaper, we saw wraparound institutions. Do you imagine there being stuff that mediates that distance?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And certainly I mean, right now you're right. We have so much information. So anyone who has an internet connection and a phone, right, they have access now suddenly to this entire library. And we see people doing incredible things. Like I remember the first time we did this experiment and we went and gave people internet they hadn't had before. And when we came back, we looked and saw what they had done, and they'd actually used YouTube to try to build a solar car. And so it's just this incredible ability for people with to be able to learn new areas and empower themselves. In terms of classes, I think we can do a lot more. So right now we are this library. I'd say we're probably in the very early stages of, you know, your comparison with Oxford. But I'm not sure always YouTube is the place to create those institutions. Like we can do a lot more. We can put content and enable features to have the content be organized in specific ways, or to enable quiz information. So we believe that we can do a lot more on YouTube to enable others. But what I think will happen is that there will be third parties that will become those Oxfords. So you can think about many different Oxfords being built upon YouTube. If we provide the features and functionality, then they could potentially provide more of the content and more of the facilities to be able to educate students and provide whatever support there is. And so I do think we're at the first inning in terms of education and online, and the opportunity to be able to do a lot more. But I think, you know, as great as we have this amazing library, but schools also provide a lot of support and interaction and ability to discuss it. And well, some of that can be done online. I do think there are these additional services that will be provided by new institutions as well as existing institutions to enable more online learning. So, so I actually have a question for you, Senator. The internet has certainly changed the way we think about so many different parts of our business, right? It's enabled people to go direct. And there's this new class of media, whether it's news or entertainment or shopping, this direct to consumer opportunity. And we also talk about YouTube creators as being these next generation media companies that now suddenly are creating all kinds of content, whether it's learning or news or entertainment. So I wanted to hear from you what you think the challenges and opportunities are when media no longer goes through traditional intermediaries like it did in the past.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the basic things we as a people, so let's set aside government for just a second, but we as a people have to recognize when you have this kind of digital disintermediation revolution, your phrase costs and opportunities or opportunities and challenges is exactly the right way to think about it, right? Every new technology brings with it new potentials, or nobody would be adopting it. There are problems that it's solving. There are upside benefits to it, but they're almost always trade-offs. And we regularly fixate on a new technological development as heaven or hell. Like utopia came or dystopia is right around the corner, right? The pencil was an amazing creation because we could store our thoughts, but it turns out people got a lot crappier at memory. Memorization went down, and some of the shared experience of synthetic poetry and oral traditions and song began to evaporate as soon as people could externalize some of their memories by putting it down in pencil. And I think we should always have this humility about new technologies where we look at the opportunity and we also say, wait a minute, what are the risks associated with it? To me, the disintermediation of many sectors is overwhelmingly good. Now I'm going to name some, and in these people are also going to be able to see downsides, but travel agency, stock brokerage, music publishing, book publishing, there used to be a lot more intermediaries in all those spaces than there are now. And as the intermediaries are pulled out, costs got cheaper because there were fewer transaction costs in the middle and there were fewer rent seekers, fighting for the center of the value chain. But also you lost things that are equivalent to steerage and advising. And in travel agency, it turned out lots of the steerage was bad. Airlines and hotel chains were paying kickbacks to people. Kickback sounds like a legally precise term. There were fees paid to privilege some options when you couldn't see into the Sabre system that American Airlines owned about what travel airline options existed for your city pairs. But mostly it was content and steerage and advisory editing that I didn't want, right? In stock brokerage, it's a little more hybrid. There are things that certain stock transactions would benefit from expertise, but lots of it, people would prefer to have a $7 transaction when they know what they want to buy, not having to wait on hold and leave a voicemail and pay somebody $175 to execute a transaction 6 hours from now. It seems to me that the loss of intermediation in news and in knowledge consumption has lots and lots of upsides. So the DIY examples that you talk about on YouTube, it is so much better and faster to be able to figure out how to solve a given problem with an appliance you have than have to call 75 people that probably wanted a retainer fee to even talk to you about how to fix this part of that appliance. So that's an almost unmitigated good, it seems to me. But in news, it turns out editing functions matter to provide some balance about whether or not this one fact that you know is a completely decontextualized fact, if you're nut picking, or if it's just a total outlier versus a larger body of information. And so I think that the direct to reader consumer is on net going to be good, but it's only going to be good once we develop the right habits of mind and humility to become more sophisticated information consumers. And it turns out in kind of, I'll pull up here, but to go total nerd for a minute, in philosophy of science, correspondence versus coherence theories of truth, if I'm trying to draw a map of the United States and I'm doing it freehand, I need to get two things right. It needs to correspond to the reality of the real world, and it needs an internal coherence that Washington to California to Florida to Maine need a certain proportionality to them, that the Washington state to Maine axis and the California to Florida needs to be wider than the height of Maine to Florida and Washington to California. And it turns out the human brain, it seems like we're much, much more biased toward coherence than correspondence. We want our pieces to fit together right and in a way that fits for our storytelling than we necessarily want it to be true. And so it appears that a lot of us consume information in a way that if there are two competing theories and there's kind of a 50-50 bet on which one might be right, and we've decided we believe this one, we're 90-10 on this side of this theory and somebody else is 10-90, the same new facts can be thrown at both of us, and each of us will filter out the half that don't fit our theory, and we'll go to confirmation bias for the ones that do. And so I think we got to become much, much more sophisticated consumers of information as 330 million Americans who want to believe in principled pluralism and a humility that doesn't just do good versus evil tribalism about everything. And right now, I think a lot of our news consumption is pretty crappy because we haven't figured out how to revalue editing in a way that fosters that kind of humility and empathy to see a bigger picture than our prior bias.
I love your historical context of all of these different issues and putting a lot of philosophy and historical context around it. And I mean, just so you know, one of the things that we have seen is we've certainly seen that when YouTube first got started, we were really focused on things like new music or lots of how-to videos like crafts. And for those, like, it's actually fine. Anyway, you know, you can have some new person post a craft video or tell you how to fix your dishwasher. And there are many different ways to do it. And if there's some misinformation about it, like, you know, maybe the craft doesn't come out as well and there's no real consequence. But when you're dealing with really sensitive information, whether that's news or medical or science information, that's a place that actually we treat very differently because we recognize that we need to be very careful in terms of the content that we're recommending. And that's actually why for those sensitive categories, we focus on the background, the authoritativeness of the publisher who's providing that information. And actually, like, you know, since you've given all these like broad thoughts, like if you think about science, right, they look at references, who's referred to different content and sources, and how many times that paper was cited as examples of authoritativeness of different medical or scientific documents. And so in a sense, like, we're also looking at publishers, providers of information. And so like in medical, we're going to look at Mayo Clinic or CDC or, you know, the American Medical Association and use all of those signals in terms of the information. So that's one of the ways we try to be able to help users connect with the right information. So it's a tricky balance because we want to enable people to post their opinions and their points of view. But when we do our recommendations, we think about the background of the publisher to make sure in sensitive areas that we're recommending an authoritative point of view.
Really, really helpful. Let's stay on that for a minute. So let's not go narrowly into a COVID rabbit hole. I didn't mean to say rabbit hole as a reference to Kevin Roos's thing, but although maybe I may pick up on that as well and talk a little bit about the guy who got sort of self-radicalized in 15 different ways by consuming YouTube content, you know, what it seemed like 10 or 15 hours a day in Kevin's telling. And so I want to come back to that, but let's not get narrowly the COVID, but stay maybe in the vaccine debates more broadly.
Sure.
How do you think about staffing for that when I think they're probably trying to figure out how to do this delicately, so I'm not trying to get near any political fights, but there are definitely fake news, nonsense versions of the anti-vax community.
Sure.
And so you all are trying to figure out how you police that or you moderate that content on your site. I assume most of it has to ultimately be done algorithmically. And so you mentioned things like the authority of different government sites or scientific citations, but how do you build out human capital in that space? Who do you hire? How do you structure that group? Where does the engagement with an external world that says, wait a minute, you guys are getting some of it wrong. The algorithm seems to be biasing this or that thing that doesn't exactly get to a public truth good?
Yeah, no, those are great questions. And definitely COVID overall has been a big challenge for us. But because we had been working on all this responsibility work, we were actually able to put a lot of that into play very, very quickly. So when COVID hit, we immediately realized that we needed to make a number of different policies. And the way we make those policies is we actually work and we consult with different health organizations. So with COVID, we worked with over 85 different global health organizations as a CDC equivalents. And we made over 10 different policies. And the things that we really focused on were things that we knew could lead to real world harm. So if you look at someone saying, like an example was, there was this conspiracy theory about 5G towers led to COVID. And obviously, very quickly, we're like, anything that says that it was not a virus was a violation of our policy. So saying that the 5G towers, which no medical authority thinks that 5G towers are actually the cause of COVID, that became a violation of our policies. And we use a combination of machines. Actually, most of our flagging is done by machines. And then we have human reviewers to review that content afterwards. So on one hand, we have policies, we remove the content that are violations of our policies, and we were very quick to do that. And that's one of the reasons I think it's so important for us to be able to have that ability, because we had to make those decisions overnight and to be able to enforce them. And then on top of that, we were really focusing on raising up authoritative information. And you talked about vaccines specifically. So we are about to run a really big vaccine campaign to be able to help people get the right information. But with COVID, we ran hundreds of billions of impressions that came from different health organizations, whether it's the CDC or local health organizations, so people got that right information. So in some sense, we're basically identifying the content that we think will lead to real world harm by working with health experts on that, using machines to be able to identify it along with some people. And then we were raising up that authoritative information. So every single video that was about COVID actually had an informational panel underneath that linked to information from a local health authority along with different playlists or other information panels across YouTube, so people could get that right information. And I actually think we play a really key role here. So one of the things that we have been able to do is actually be able to connect a lot of users who otherwise would not have sought out public health information. So like an example was we had Trevor Noah interview Dr. Fauci, right? And he was able to ask a lot of really hard questions that young people were thinking, but that were super relevant, and put it in a place where people could learn public health information who might not have been seeking it. So we're planning to do the same thing with vaccine information, as well as reach out to a lot of underserved communities to make sure that they get the information that they need. So think about artists, musicians, doing medical interviews to be able to make sure people have the right information about vaccines and COVID.
It's helpful. I know because we're in a vote sequence here on the Hill, we shouldn't stay on this topic. I'll move us along, but I do want to at some point, I'll follow up with you offline, think about the distinction between the hard fact questions and the more provisional speculative policy recommendations, right? Because we have this hard challenge of, if we're going to get institutions like the CDC to be more trusted and more respected by the American people, I think we have to have a clearer line between factual questions that folks like that who are not elected are speaking to versus the value-based theory of how you do the trade-offs about the loss for kids across America of not having been in school for the last 13, 14 months at a level where the disease is less dangerous than the flu for certain young age populations. That's a factual thing we know now. And yet the trade-off questions, how you guys think about where and who you privilege when in your algorithm is really important and interesting.
Sure.
And hard
Sure.
work.
I mean, we have lots of debate. We have lots of people who are debating lots of different things. We have a very broad range, and we really want to enable a diversity of voices. We want to have the discussion. But really where we draw the line is when it comes to something that we know leads to real world harm. And that's where we want to be careful. And that's where we turn to medical guidance to be able to make sure that our users are getting the information that is coming from different medical authorities. So we definitely talk more about it. It's been a really important time, and I look forward to discussing it further with you.
When we think about the way foreign nation states want to capitalize on the internal division in the US, right? I mean, we have all these benefits of being a free and open society, but it means that our debates are often longer lasting than more authoritarian regimes that can just suppress dissenting viewpoints. And so they are interested, the Russia, China, Iran, North Korea continuum are all interested in the potential divisions in our community, in our 330 million Americans, becoming deeper. And they algorithmically want to generate more confirmation bias fake news and confirmation bias worldview certainty that assume anybody who disagrees with you isn't just wrong or misguided or has a different value set, but they're fundamentally evil and we need to be divided from them. So I think about the tension you all must have about how public you are about the particulars of your, I wouldn't say guidelines, but your decision making. Because at one level, I would assume that most people don't really understand what your community guidelines are. But you're transparent about the four corners of that, but the details as they inform the algorithm, if you were more clear about it, it also means they're easier to game by people who want to just barely get around the edge of the bad behavior you're trying to prohibit. How do you decide how transparent to be about community guidelines, especially in cases that become really politicized and angry in a moment in the US?
Right. I mean, well, first of all, we try to be transparent with our policies because we know that our creators depend upon it. And when videos, for one reason or another, may not be monetized or may be removed, like, we really want to be transparent with our users about it. And we've tried to be more and more transparent over time and give more guidance. But you talked about foreign government interference, basically, of governments coming in and wanting to sow division in the United States. And that's not necessarily an area where we would have an issue being transparent about our policies, because we have a very clear policy that we don't allow foreign government interference. We don't allow different types of coordinated accounts coming from foreign governments with the goal of misleading or trying to sow division. So that's a place where we actually, at Google, we actually have a group that works across all the Google products to really work and to be able to identify that very quickly. And we have removed in the past, and we've been public about the different videos that we have removed from different governments to make sure that we are not enabling any kind of foreign government interference. And around the election, we were on heightened alert. We had additional people. We had basically like our own intelligence desk. We were always looking to see what is happening to make sure that we were ahead of that, and we were able to remove that content because that's always clear. I mean, we just have a clear policy that that's not allowed.
Right, but I agree, and I understand and appreciate that. And Vladimir Putin's use of what you call coordinated accounts is not nearly as sophisticated as what this Chinese Communist Party will do when they decide to deploy similar tools on a broader basis. I mean, Putin never says, "Hi, I'm Vladimir Putin doing this terrible stuff." He funds and takes bribes from all of his oligarchic, partners in crime, and they figure out ways to be plural and entrepreneurial, and then he has lots of deniability about it. It's big and clunky, and you all are pretty good at finding the coordinated accounts that come from essentially allied, nominally private sector, but Russian intelligence services spam accounts. What the CCP will ultimately have the capacity to do, or already has the capacity to do, and might ultimately deploy, is a lot scarier because it's going to be so much more sophisticated. And so I think it's a challenge that we, both the American private and public sectors, need to be clear with the American people about the challenges that we face, because as the technology continues to evolve, the riddle you all have to manage gets harder and harder to crack, I think.
It does, but our technology gets better and better. And so I really think that, that's one of the reasons that we have so focused to be able to understand and have leading edge technologists, whether they're understanding AI or all different parts of the ecosystem and the technology that we have. And I mean, yes, sure, I think foreign governments pose a challenge and have a lot of advanced technology, but we see that every single day. I mean, we see spammers, we see a lot of different types of attacks that are coming not just from governments, but from sophisticated individuals or groups. And that's part of the responsibility to make sure that we are able to handle that. And our technology is getting better and better. And we've had a big focus on this for many, many years. And so I feel confident that we will continue to invest in here to make sure that we are always keeping our users safe, and we are staying ahead of the game and ahead of all the spammers and hackers out there who are trying to interfere in one way with our systems. So we'll keep on it. But we recognize it is an area where you need to continue to invest. So I think I get to ask you a question. All right. So what do you think is the role of government in regulating free speech? There's been lots of discussion about this, and there certainly hasn't been any kind of alignment. I hear very different and often opposing points of view from different people coming from our own government. And what do you think is the role of the private sector with regard to free speech?
I mean, one of the most beautiful things about the American experiment is that in Philadelphia, 1787, a bunch of people got together and said, in ways that were aspirationally brilliant and beautiful, in effect, we rarely lived up to our ideals, but the American ideals are unrivaled in human history as a declaration of the fact that we believe then 4-ish million people, today 330 million people on a continental nation. It's true of 7.8 billion people across the globe, but the 330 million Americans say together in a compact, we believe everybody is created with universal dignity. The government doesn't give us our rights. People have dignity that is pre-governmental. And the most fundamental statement of that cluster of beautiful rights that flow from our dignity is that we think everybody has freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of press or publication, freedom of assembly, the right to protest. And these 5 freedoms, they're clustered. It wouldn't mean much to say you have freedom of religion, but you can't assemble with your co-religionists. It wouldn't mean much to say you have the freedom of speech, but you can't write down your thoughts and disseminate them to other people, either in a printed form or standing up in a digital format somewhere. So the rights of the people to have all of this sense that the dignity of being ensouled means that we don't think power is the first thing. We think the purpose of power is to maintain a framework for ordered liberty, free from violence, free from oppression, so that you are free to build the next great app. You are free to invite people to join the Rotary Club or your synagogue or your church. You are free to worship freely. You are free to protest when the government has failed to live up to the obligations that it has. And so to me, the first thing we have to do is make sure we don't cross this precipice that we see bubbling up on campus a lot in the US right now, which is to conflate speech and physical violence as if they're the same thing, as if there's no distinction. The government's responsibility is to protect you from violence so that you can argue. maybe shouting at each other in the street sometimes, but hopefully most often inviting people over to the dinner table and breaking bread together and drinking wine together and saying, hey, how could you believe this knuckleheaded thing? I want to persuade you that this is a better way to pursue the good, the true, and the beautiful. The interesting things in life aren't about coercion. They're about love and persuasion and entrepreneurship. And so the government's responsibility is to maintain the public square in a way that guarantees people are free from violence and the threat of violence. So there is speech that's like violence, and that is the intimidating speech that threatens physical harm. But to say to someone, I believe this thing and you believe this other thing, so that means I think you're wrong, it's definitely not the government's job to police any of that. It's the government's job to let people argue it out, but with a whole bunch of maintenance of public order so that there's not violence or threats of violence that constrain that pursuit of happiness, truth, beauty, love, persuasion, innovation. The private sector, we definitely have to have debates about scale and about potential monopoly, but I think it's very important, especially for people on my side of the aisle. So I'm one of the more conservative members of the Senate by voting record, but I'm not very partisan. Republicans have increasingly adopted this idea that Section 230 is the big bad boogeyman out there, and we need to take it away. And I don't agree with those arguments because I think it's fundamentally important for us to recognize that private sector companies don't have the same obligations as the federal government does, because it isn't private sector companies' job to prohibit violence and maintain order. Content moderation policies need to be transparent. I want to fight sometimes with your or other organizations about what content moderation policies you use and whether or not they're consistently applied. And I do think there are conversations about scale and monopoly and antitrust we should have. But I want a world where there are more options around content moderation. In a world where there's going to be increasing different disinformation out there, the content moderation policies need to be transparent. There need to be plural options for people and communities to go to. But you want to be in a community where you can turn up or down, but especially in a world with more disinformation, turn up content moderation so I can get to the information that I actually want to use. So there's a lot more we should discuss there. We're out of time, and I'm really disappointed because the main question I wanted to ask you, I never even got to, which is my garage is filled with like a bunch of broken down mowers and chainless bikes and mud covered tennis shoes. And somehow you turned your garage into, one of the most interesting tech companies in the world. And I want to know what I need to do to transform my garage into something the history books will write about and that might pay for my kids' college education. How did you do this in your garage?
I think you could certainly go and ask some computer science students at the University of Nebraska to see if they're interested in renting your garage. I'm sure you would have lots of takers.
Did you have special?
You could have the next Google in your garage.
Good stuff. To be continued.
But I wish we had more. I have a lot to say, and I definitely agree that private companies, there's a lot of times we need to take action. We have a whole community of advertisers and users, and we really focus on actions that we need to take to prevent real world harm. And our advertisers hold us accountable also. I think that's one of the points that I think a lot of times isn't understood, that they don't want to be on, there's a lot of advertisers don't want to be on certain kinds of content, and they also don't want us to have it. And if we do have it, they see us leading to real world harm. And so in many ways, we're responding to market forces to make sure that we're able to continue to grow our business and continue to grow YouTube and do the right thing for our users and our community. But I wish we had more time. We'll have to have like a part 2 to this. And hopefully we can do that in person. And I can give you lots of tips on renting your garage. I can, if you want, I can even interview your potential CS students who want to rent your garage.
I'm sure there's a Senate ethics problem if I use you to filter my future tech.
Oh, sorry. Well, no, we won't do that then. We wouldn't do that.
I like this idea. Thank you. Thanks to Sedona Forum. Thank you to the McCain Institute. Cindy, hello. Wish we could be together. Take care.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you to the Sedona Forum, and thank you to everyone who set this up. To be continued.